She walked into the courthouse in a yellow suit that stopped time. No badge, no words, just presence. In under 10 minutes, a white officer pointed at her face, touched her forehead, and made a decision that would end his career. What happened next shook the system. Want the full truth? Watch until the end. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories they tried to bury but couldn't silence. At 8:15 in the morning, the federal courthouse stood silent, encased in thick gray marble that caught no warmth from the rising sun. It loomed like an old judge, unmoved, cold, carved into the city like a warning. The air was still except for the sharp click of a single pair of heels on the stone steps. That sound did not echo. It cut. And then came the color. Zora Mitchell appeared at the base of the courthouse in a tailored yellow suit, clean-cut and form-fitting, as if stitched from confidence itself. The color wasn't neon or flamboyant. It was golden, the kind of yellow that dares the gray around it to ask questions. The blazer hugged her shoulders with quiet power, the trousers precise, her black heels striking the polished stone with metronome precision. No briefcase, just a small leather pouch under one arm and a single pen clipped to the inside of her lapel like a weapon. The courthouse had seen thousands enter its doors, judges in robes, defendants in handcuffs, lawyers dragging case files like anchors, but Zora wasn't part of that rhythm. She didn't blend in. She didn't announce herself either. She simply moved, and the building reacted. People from across the street paused mid-sip of their coffee. One delivery driver leaned out of his window, eyes locked on the bright silhouette cutting through the gray. She didn't glance around for directions. She didn't hesitate at the metal railing or squint up at the rows of columns overhead. She had been here before, just not like this. Inside the courthouse lobby, Officer Brian Talcott sat with one leg propped lazily against the desk frame, watching the security monitors with disinterest. White male, mid-40s, 15 years in courthouse enforcement. He wore authority like it was his birthright. He knew the routine, and the routine rarely surprised him. The people that came through this place didn't rattle him, until now. His eye caught a flicker of something off on the steps, except the monitor didn't show it. He looked up. There, in real time, she appeared beyond the glass entrance. Yellow suit, black woman, alone, walking like she didn't owe the building an explanation. Something tightened in Brian's stomach before he even realized he'd stood up. He pressed his palm against the exit bar of the glass door and stepped outside, blocking the entry path with the kind of casual arrogance that only came from years of never being challenged. Zora reached the top of the stairs and paused. Not because of him, not because of fear, but because silence can speak louder than entrance. Brian narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me, this is a secure federal building," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it wasn't polite either. It wasn't about procedure. It was about posture. Zora looked at him, once, a single second that stretched longer than it should have. Then she nodded faintly and said, "I'm here on assignment, DOJ Internal Investigations." She made no attempt to flash a badge. Her hands stayed at her sides, fingers relaxed, shoulders aligned. Brian didn't move. He didn't nod. He didn't ask questions. His eyes traveled from the shine of her shoes up to the yellow of her blazer. His gaze didn't stop at her ID lanyard or her pen. It stopped on her face. Then, without warning, he raised his finger and pointed at her. Not at her badge, not at her chest, like standard procedure. His finger rose higher, directly at her face, nearly brushing her cheek. Then he tapped his fingertip twice against her forehead, like he was pressing a button that didn't belong. Zora didn't blink. She didn't step back. But something behind her eyes changed. Sharp, focused, not angry, but ready. but ready. Brian's mouth curled. "You think walking in here in a sunshine suit makes you someone?" he asked, fingers still hovering near her skin. "You don't just stroll in looking like that and expect to be above protocol." She spoke then, calmly, steadily. "Careful, your hand's writing something you can't erase." Brian laughed, short and dry. "Let's see some ID. You could be anyone." Trying to make a scene in a government building. Zora remained still. She pulled her ID from her pouch. Not fast, not slow. Held it, didn't hand it over. He didn't even look down at it. His finger jabbed toward her forehead again. "Right here," he said. This is what I don't trust." A second passed. 2. Then she said, "That's the most honest thing you've said all morning." The door behind him hissed open slightly. Just a gust of wind, or maybe someone watching, but he didn't notice. His focus was locked on her, and hers had already passed judgment. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed in the hallways. Clerks sipped coffee. Courtrooms filled, motions were filed, and outside, on the courthouse steps, yellow stood against gray, and someone had already made a mistake they wouldn't recover from. Zora didn't need to push forward. She knew the cameras had begun rolling, silent witnesses hanging from the corners of the building, watching what people pretend not to see. This was not the moment she would draw her badge. Not yet. Let them write their assumptions first. Let the wrong words be spoken. Let the record build itself, one arrogant finger at a time. And, when the moment was right, when all eyes were on the stranger in the yellow suit, the truth would land harder than any shout. The question wasn't whether the system would be tested. The question was, what happens when it's tested by someone it didn't see coming? The metal detector stood like a gatekeeper. Dull, indifferent, the kind of machine that judged only by metal, not malice. Just past the threshold, Zora Mitchell stepped forward, her yellow suit catching the dull courthouse lights like a signal flare someone had forgotten to turn off. She didn't pause at the scanner. She didn't need to. She was federal clearance, internal division, DOJ oversight. But Officer Brian Talcott stood in front of the arch like he owned not just the building, but the story unfolding within it. "Ma'am," he barked, already irritated. His tone didn't request. It presumed. Zora met his eyes without shifting her footing. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "Special Agent Zora Mitchell, here on scheduled assignment." That should have been enough. But it wasn't. It never was. Brian took a half-step forward. Not toward her badge. Not toward the desk. Toward her. The space between them shrank. He moved past protocol and directly into personal intrusion, crowding her with the weight of his authority. He wasn't reading her credentials. He was reading her face. And then, without hesitation, he pointed his finger at her cheek, his arm rigid, his jaw tight. "You think you can walk in here?" he hissed, "dressed like that and not answer to anyone?" His words hit like spit against stone. His finger, still raised, tapped her forehead. Once, then again, just hard enough to make a point. Not out of confusion. Out of contempt. The second tap was louder than the first. Not in sound, but in intention. Zora didn't flinch. She didn't move an inch, but her body straightened, not from fear, but from calculated restraint. Her chin lifted by a fraction, just enough to make it known. "You've crossed a line." Behind her, the air conditioner hummed. The clerk behind the counter, pretending to review paperwork, froze mid-page. A camera in the corner tilted slightly, then clicked into position. Zora blinked. Once, slowly. Then her voice came, soft, even, but every syllable laced with steel. "Careful. Your hand's writing something you can't erase." The space between them collapsed, not physically, but morally. Brian's posture shifted, not backward, not yet, but a visible recalibration began in his spine. He wasn't just dealing with someone difficult. He was dealing with someone documented. His laugh came out clipped and false, a bark without bite. "Is that supposed to be a threat?" Zora didn't answer. He stepped sideways and motioned to the side table. "Let's see your ID, if you even have one." She moved precisely. No sudden gestures, no panic, just a slow reach into the inner pocket of her blazer, where her federal credentials rested inside a matte leather case. She lifted it in one hand, opened it like scripture, and held it in front of her. No closer, no further than was necessary. He looked, but not at the badge. He didn't read the lettering, didn't even glance at the hologram seal. His eyes returned to her face. "Pretty fancy," he muttered, his voice lowering like a threat he hadn't finished yet. "What agency did you say?" She didn't say. Not again. That's when he leaned in once more and again pointed to her forehead, like he was pushing blame into her skin. "This," he sneered, "is what doesn't belong here." For a moment, time went still. Not dramatically, not cinematically, but tensely, as if the courthouse itself inhaled and forgot how to exhale. Zora's eyes didn't narrow. They widened just slightly, not in shock, in confirmation. She stepped to the side, not retreating, but reclaiming the space that had been invaded, and calmly slid her badge back into her jacket. The security scanner beeped from behind her. No metal, no danger, just a woman in yellow who had committed the sin of confidence in the wrong skin. Brian's voice sharpened. "You gonna walk in like that? Bright as hell, and expect me not to ask questions?" Zora replied without pause. "You didn't ask questions. You made statements." His neck stiffened. "Don't get smart." "I'm already cleared," she said, low but direct. "You're just getting loud." For a second, it looked like he might back down, but Brian had worked too many years without anyone checking his tone. He doubled down instead. He extended his arm again, finger pointed at her eyes this time, a fraction too close. "Listen here," but he never finished the sentence, because Zora raised one hand, open, calm, palm up. Not in resistance, not to stop him, but to hold his action in view, as if to present it as evidence to a room not yet watching, but soon to be. "You're performing," she said, her tone razor flat. "But the cameras don't need drama, just clarity." His face twitched. There was movement behind the counter. A second security officer stepped out from the back hallway, paused, and watched, uncertain. Zora didn't step back. She didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her sleeve, looked toward the hallway, and said, "You're obstructing a federal assignment." Brian scoffed. "You're obstructing common sense." But even he could feel it. The room had changed. It wasn't just about a woman in a yellow suit anymore. It was about what he had touched, and what it would mean when that video played back later, in a courtroom, a news clip, a Senate hearing. Zora turned her head, just slightly, enough to let the ceiling camera see her full profile, then spoke clearly. "This moment, your voice, your finger, your assumptions, are being recorded." Brian froze, then turned toward the camera. In that instant, his authority stopped being invisible, and became evidence. The air around them pulsed, not with noise, but with the weight of what had just happened. The finger taps, the forehead, the way he never looked at the badge. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was contempt, captured in real time. Zora stepped forward, past him, her yellow suit brushing against his gray shoulder like daybreak slipping through fog. Behind her, Brian said nothing, because somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew. He had just touched the wrong person, on the wrong day, in the worst possible way. The silence in the lobby hung like a held breath, suspended, heavy, and stretching far too long. Zora Mitchell had just spoken the words that turned observation into evidence. "Your voice, your finger, Your assumptions are being recorded. But Brian Talcott wasn't done. Men like him didn't back away when challenged. They tightened their grip. His face, flushed around the cheekbones, didn't show fear. It showed something more dangerous: bruised ego wrapped in the uniform of authority. And now he needed to prove something, not to her, but to the building, the cameras, and to himself. Impersonation of a federal agent is a felony, he said suddenly, loud enough for the second officer in the hallway to hear. No move, Officer Veen. You don't appear in a highlighter suit and expect a free pass. Pass. Zora didn't respond. Her eyes didn't even shift in his direction. She simply looked ahead, toward the long marbled corridor that led to the courtrooms, past the silent security scanners and polished floors. She moved like someone walking toward something she'd already predicted. Brian took her silence as defiance. "I said," he snapped, then reached for her elbow, gripping it hard, fingers digging just above the joint. It wasn't a guiding hold, it was possession. He wasn't leading her, he was claiming her, like she had just become part of his jurisdiction. But Zora didn't resist. She moved with him, each step deliberate, steady, her posture upright, composed. Not because he had control, but because she understood visibility. She knew where every surveillance camera sat, where the blind spots ended, and when the hallway lighting would hit her yellow suit just right, making every frame undeniable. Undeniable. Brian's grip stayed tight as he marched beside her down the corridor. His pace wasn't frantic, it was practiced. Like he'd escorted others before. Like this was just another day where suspicion wore black skin and assertion wore yellow, and he couldn't tell the difference between professionalism and threat. "Where's your damn paperwork?" he spat, loud enough to echo against the limestone walls. "You think a cheap badge and a confident tone make you real?" Zora didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence was surgical. Not passive, not timid, but exposing. It forced him to fill the silence with his own noise, his own assumptions. They passed a hallway junction. A clerk in beige stopped mid-step, frozen between duty and disbelief. She caught the full scene: Zora's golden suit, the white-knuckled grip on her arm, Brian's puffed posture, and something deeper. That this didn't feel like security. It felt like theater. But the kind of theater that ends in lawsuits. Still, the clerk said nothing. Brian's voice dropped lower as they passed another corridor camera. "Where you headed, huh? Trying to get in someone's chamber and pull rank? Think a smile and a shiny blazer gets you through restricted doors?" Still no response. He jabbed his finger again, this time into her shoulder, just above the heart. "You listening?" Zora's step didn't break, but her eyes turned slowly to the side wall where the camera was mounted, as if to remind it. Keep watching. Brian didn't like the silence. He never had. He needed something, anything, to validate what was happening. He reached again, this time for her lapel, his finger jabbing directly at her badge pocket. "I want to see that thing again, right now." But he didn't pull it out. He didn't unclip it. He just touched it, his fingertip pressing once, then twice, against the badge tucked inside the suit, like he was trying to erase it by touch. Still, Zora said nothing. That silence wasn't emptiness. It was documentation. Every step, every shove, every word. She was letting him walk himself into the very file she would later sign. They approached the intersection before the main courtroom wing. A faint hum came from the fluorescent lights above. From one of the offices behind a frosted glass door, someone looked up, squinted, and then slowly stood. But Zora's gaze stayed forward. Her hand didn't resist. Her stride never broke. She was walking willingly, Not because he had power over her, but because he had just crossed into a place she needed him to be, too far in to lie his way out. His voice rose again, as if he felt the power slipping from his grasp. "You're gonna regret pretending to be someone you're not. When this is over, that suit won't matter. Your silence won't save you. Won't save you." Zora finally spoke. Just 5 words. "It's not meant to." He blinked. That shook him more than a scream would have. He wanted her angry. He wanted her to yell, push back, make it easy for him to call it disorderly conduct. But instead, she was offering him enough rope to write his own confession. At that moment, a third camera above the courtroom entrance tilted with a mechanical click. Brian's head snapped up for half a second. Then he turned to her again. "You want everyone watching?" he asked, teeth clenched. "You think people care about this? Some fancy girl trying to pretend she runs the place?" Zora didn't answer, but her eyes met his, finally. And it hit him then. She wasn't pretending, and the cameras didn't just watch her. They watched him. His grip, his finger, the jab to her chest, the unlawful accusation, the refusal to read the ID, and behind every angle, the color yellow glowed like a spotlight on misconduct. Bright, undeniable, impossible to mute. They arrived at the courtroom door. Brian scanned his badge with one hand, still gripping her with the other. As the lock clicked open, Zora turned slightly. Not to look at him, but to let her words fall near his ear before they stepped inside. "You didn't escort me here. You followed me into a record you can't erase." He didn't understand it yet, but he would. Because in the next 10 minutes, every finger he pointed, every word he spat, and every assumption he carried like a shield would be stripped down to evidence. Not just of misconduct, but of a culture too long protected by silence. And yellow would be the last thing he ever underestimated. The courtroom door burst open like a verdict issued too soon, loud, impatient, and without decorum. The polished wood smacked against the stopper with a dull thud, drawing every eye in the room toward its frame. And through it walked Zora Mitchell, her yellow suit blazing like a protest against the silence that had just been broken. Officer Brian Talcott stood behind her, jaw tight, one hand still clamped around her upper arm, the other hovering near his badge as if it could shield him from what was coming. He didn't speak, not yet, but his posture screamed ownership, like he had caught something that didn't belong. But the room felt it instantly. He was the one out of place. Zora stepped past the threshold without resistance. Her heels tapped softly across the courtroom floor, a sharp contrast to the booming entry. She paused at the first row of benches, then gently adjusted the cuff of her blazer, brushed a crease from her sleeve, and straightened her back. Not out of pride, but precision. The yellow fabric seemed to glow against the washed-out tones of the chamber. Everything else, robes, suits, files, flags, was built in shades of black, gray, and muted respectability. But Zora's presence wasn't just visual. It was a rupture in the room's assumed order. Judge Renata Lyles, seated high on the bench beneath the dark seal of the federal court, paused mid-sentence. Her gavel had not yet dropped, but the words she'd been speaking trailed off like dust in air. Her eyes fixed on the figure entering her courtroom, poised, radiant, unbothered. There was a hesitation, not a gasp, just a murmur, low and subtle, like a thought shared by glances rather than voices. It passed from the defense table to the clerks, from the rows of attorneys to the spectators in the back. Everyone saw the same thing. A black woman, dressed like sunshine, walking as if she had built the courtroom herself. Brian's grip lingered for half a beat too long before he released her arm, fingers twitching slightly. He glanced toward the judge, then toward the security detail by the wall, searching for cues. Approval, instruction, anything. He received nothing. Silence. Zora didn't acknowledge him. Her eyes swept once around the courtroom, not seeking permission, just locating faces. She noted the clerk's raised brow, the court reporter's pen frozen mid-stroke, the assistant U.S. attorney's gaze narrowing with curiosity. She stepped forward again, uninvited, unaffected, and the room adjusted itself around her. No one knew her name yet, but they knew enough. She was not the defendant. She was not a witness. She was not lost. And that yellow suit, which had seemed so misplaced in the cold gray hallway, now stood like a spotlight in a theater built to hide things. Brian cleared his throat, speaking too loud and too fast. "Your Honor, I've identified an individual in a restricted hallway, unverified and—" "Name?" Judge Lyles cut in, her voice calm but crisp. He blinked. Sorry. Did she give you a name?" Brian hesitated. "She presented credentials, but I couldn't confirm authenticity." Judge Lyles leaned forward an inch, hands resting on the bench like the edge of a scale. "Is she under arrest?" "No, ma'am," he said quickly. "Is she detained?" He hesitated again. Zora stepped into the open space before the bench, turned toward the judge, and finally spoke. "Special Agent Zora Mitchell, Department of Justice, Internal Investigations Division. I'm here on authorized observation per sealed docket 41-B. The murmur came again, sharper this time. The clerk's hand went to the schedule sheet. The court reporter resumed typing, faster now. Brian's face turned 2 shades paler. "She didn't say that when I asked," he muttered, almost to himself. Judge Lyles glanced at the clerk. "Do we have any note on 417B? A nod. "Is it sealed?" Another nod. The judge turned back toward Zora. "Do you have credentials?" Zora reached into her inner pocket, slowly, deliberately, and produced the black wallet badge. She opened it with the same poise one might use to recite a prayer. A ritual of truth presented without decoration. The gold shimmered under the overhead lights. Embossed lettering, embedded chip, official seal, unmistakable. She held it for 5 full seconds, long enough for every pair of eyes to see, long enough for Brian to feel it land like judgment. Judge Lyles raised an eyebrow. "That appears authentic." Zora nodded once. "It is." The courtroom hung in stillness for a beat. Then the judge spoke again, this time to Brian. "Officer Talcott, did you verify her badge?" He shifted his weight. "She didn't give me the chance." Zora didn't speak. She didn't need to. The judge's gaze lingered. "Did you ask?" Brian opened his mouth, then closed it again. Zora turned back toward the gallery and scanned the room one last time, then walked to the second bench, sat down calmly, and crossed her legs, hands resting softly atop one knee. Her suit gleamed beneath the skylight. She had entered the room not as an intruder, but as a mirror. Everything that came next wouldn't be an argument. It would be a reflection of what had already happened, down that hallway, under those cameras, in front of that door. Brian didn't move. He stood beside the courtroom wall, no longer certain whether he was security or a case study. The badge on his chest weighed heavier than usual, not from pride, but from exposure. He looked around for someone, anyone, to rescue the narrative. No one stepped forward. Because Zora had already rewritten it, without shouting, without pointing, without even standing. The courtroom had been built for judgment. But today, judgment had walked in wearing yellow. The silence that followed Zora Mitchell's calm seating in the courtroom didn't feel like stillness. It felt like containment, a pressure building in every corner of the chamber. It wasn't just that a woman in a yellow suit had walked in unannounced. It wasn't just that her very presence had severed the rhythm of the day. It was that she had absorbed an entire confrontation without flinching, and now, seated 2 benches from the front, she had taken the room hostage without raising her voice. Officer Brian Talcott stood by the side wall, unmoving, lips parted slightly, fingers grazing the edge of his belt. Not in readiness, but in uncertainty. He had walked her in like a prize, like he had caught something unauthorized. But now he stood before a courtroom full of eyes, asking a new question. Had he brought in proof of his own misconduct instead? Judge Renata Lyles leaned back slightly in her chair, watching both of them. Her expression gave away nothing, but her fingers tapped once on the edge of her bench. A signal for order, not from noise, but from thought. Zora didn't look shaken. She looked timed. Every move she had made up until now had been by design. Every step, every silence, every refusal to push back too early. But now came the moment not of retaliation, but of definition. Slowly, she reached into her shoulder bag. Not urgently, not nervously, but like someone opening a file that had already been read too many times. Her hand emerged with a black leather badge case, the stitching neat, the corners unfrayed. She walked forward without asking permission, not out of disrespect, but because authorization doesn't wait for ceremony. The clerk at the front desk shifted in her seat, instinctively reaching for a form, then pausing as Zora arrived, her steps silent, but every eye following her. Zora paused at the edge of the desk and, with the delicacy of someone placing a truth on record, laid her credentials on the surface. The leather opened with a soft creak. Inside, the metallic badge caught the courtroom light, like a blade drawn under oath. The seal read, Department of Internal Federal Review, Special Agent Zora Mitchell. Her name sat beneath the insignia in raised lettering, clear, final, unimpeachable. The room held its breath. Then she turned, slowly, deliberately, and faced the man still standing near the wall. Brian Talcott, once puffed with confidence, now blinking faster than usual, as if his brain were struggling to delete the last 15 minutes and re-record something less damning. Zora's gaze didn't waver. Now point to that, she said. 3 seconds passed, then 4. Brian didn't move. The same finger that had jabbed her forehead, that had touched her badge pocket like an eraser, now hung uselessly at his side. The line she'd spoken didn't rise in tone. It didn't accuse. It simply placed a mirror before him and asked, "Do you dare?" He took a step back. Not large. Just one shoe retreating half a length. But in a courtroom, movement means meaning. And everyone saw it. The clerk's eyes flicked to the judge. The stenographer pressed her pedal harder, typing faster now. The public gallery, small but filled, remained stiff. No murmurs this time, no whispers, just recognition. In that single moment, the entire room inverted. Zora was no longer the woman escorted in. She was the authority that had walked in on its own terms, dragged only in body, not in standing. Brian's jaw flexed, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. There was nothing left to question. Zora hadn't shouted. She hadn't threatened. She had simply revealed. That badge on the desk didn't need backup. It had weight. The kind of weight that doesn't fall with noise, but settles with finality. Judge Lyles finally broke the silence, her voice low but fully restored to authority. Officer Talcott, I believe you've made a procedural error. Brian turned toward the judge as if waking from a long fall. Your Honor, But she raised a hand. No, not yet. The judge's tone wasn't angry. It was restrained. The kind of restraint that held 1,000 implications behind measured pauses. She looked toward Zora. Agent Mitchell, are you currently assigned to this courthouse under DOJ directive? Zora nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. Observational clearance. Internal review. Division B74. Files on record. Was your entry pre-cleared? It was. The entry scanner malfunctioned. My badge failed to log, but I scanned it twice before being intercepted. The judge glanced toward the bailiff. A silent instruction passed. Behind her, a security monitor lit up, and the feed from the entrance lobby began to play. Grainy, time-stamped, unavoidable. It showed everything. Zora entering the building. Brian standing up before reviewing the monitor. The confrontation. The finger, the forehead, the grip. The badge ignored. The walk down the corridor. The second jab. The push through the door. The footage paused. On screen, Zora stood in the exact position she did now. Her posture hadn't changed. Her silence had always been intentional. Back in the courtroom, Brian's breathing became audible. Shallow, rapid, edged with disbelief. He had not expected to be recorded. He had not expected the courtroom to turn. But power doesn't ask for expectation. It arrives, calm and undeniable. Judge Lyles looked at him again, but this time with distance, the way one might observe a file about to be sealed. "Officer Talcott," she said carefully, "I suggest you step outside. This matter will be formally reviewed." Brian opened his mouth again, but this time only air came out. Zora remained still, hands folded neatly in front of her, and in the space between them, on the desk, untouched, sat the badge. Not a badge of defense, not a badge of threat, a badge of proof. And in a room built for judgment, that was the only authority that spoke clearly. The door at the rear of the courtroom opened without drama. No slam, no rush, just the quiet click of a handle turning with purpose. A man stepped through, wearing a charcoal gray suit, crisp white shirt, no tie. His walk was silent, precise. His presence did not ask for attention, but like Zora's yellow suit, it took the room anyway. Special Agent Marcus Teal. His name wasn't announced, but those who mattered knew it instantly. His badge rested beneath his lapel, barely visible, but no less official. He wasn't there to speak for her. He was there to speak to the record. In his right hand, he carried a sealed folder, marked with the deep red band used only for internal DOJ oversight communications, B74 level. Few in the room knew what that level meant. Fewer still knew how rare it was to see that classification in person. He didn't look at Brian Talcott. He didn't look at the gallery, the judge, or the startled bailiff by the wall. He walked straight toward Zora and gave her the slightest nod. Not deference, acknowledgement. The kind that passes between those who have been through more than they'll ever speak aloud. Then he turned, stepped toward the bench, and handed the folder directly to Judge Renata Lyles, who accepted it with both hands, an unspoken sign that she knew this wasn't just evidence. It was exposure. The room held its breath again. Judge Lyles slit the red tape with her letter opener and unfolded the contents slowly. Her eyes scanned the top page, and then the next. Her pupils narrowed. Her fingers tightened slightly on the paper. When she spoke, her voice dropped into something cold and deliberate. The contents of this file confirm that Officer Brian Talcott has been the subject of 5 prior internal complaints related to racial profiling, excessive use of force, and violations of protocol, spanning over 6 years. The statement landed like a dropped stone into a still lake. Ripples through the gallery. A rustle among the defense tables. A sideways glance between clerks. Brian's mouth opened, slightly parted like he might object, but there was nothing to object to. The truth had been filed, stamped, and sealed long before Zora walked through the courthouse door. All she did was pull back the curtain. Still seated in the second row, Zora Mitchell did nothing. She didn't nod. She didn't smirk. She didn't look at Brian. She just waited. Because this was no longer about opinion. It was about documentation. Brian's voice finally cracked the silence. Those complaints were all unfounded. Nothing stuck. Marcus Teal turned to him, slowly, calmly, like someone listening to the wind claim it had no direction. "That's incorrect," he said, voice low and exact. 2 were dropped under technical error. 3 were dismissed due to insufficient third-party corroboration. None were cleared based on exonerating evidence. He let the words settle. Judge Lyles looked up. Why were these records not raised during regular courthouse personnel evaluations? Marcus answered without emotion. They were sealed at administrative discretion. Those seals have now been lifted. Brian's knees stiffened. This is retaliation. You're trying to make a show of me. No, Marcus replied. You made a show of yourself. The rest is paperwork. Zora remained still. Her hands rested on her knee, posture composed. Her yellow suit, once questioned as inappropriate, now stood out for what it was, a warning they didn't recognize in time. Brian's eyes darted from Zora to the judge to the gallery, trying to find a safe point of focus. There wasn't one. This is insane, he muttered. I was doing my job. No, Marcus said, stepping closer. You were doing something you mistook for your job. The courtroom didn't move. It didn't need to. The collapse wasn't dramatic. It was systemic, silent, like a structure finally realizing its own weight. Judge Lyles began to write something, her pen moving slowly, not because she was unsure, but because the act itself demanded weight. In the back of the room, a court officer leaned toward a colleague, whispering under his breath, "How did this not come up sooner?" Because it was never meant to. Because complaints filed against officers rarely make it past the first locked drawer. Because men like Brian were protected by the same silence they weaponized. But not today. Today, that silence had been dragged into the open by heels clicking across marble, by a gold badge laid calmly on a desk, by a woman who didn't need to argue, only to arrive. Judge Lyles finally looked toward Zora. Agent Mitchell, is there anything you'd like to add? Zora shook her head once. No, Your Honor. The restraint in that reply hit harder than any accusation. She could have listed everything. The finger, the forehead, the grip, the second jab, the dismissal of credentials, the assumption embedded in every syllable of Brian's voice. But she didn't. She didn't need to, because the file spoke louder than she ever could, because her presence had already been louder than a gavel. And Marcus, stoic, unmoved, folded his hands behind his back. His job wasn't to defend her. It was to confirm what the system had ignored for too long. Brian lowered his head. Not in shame. Not yet. But in dread. Because now the system had been flipped. He was no longer the authority in the room. He was the subject. Outside the windows, the sun had climbed halfway across the sky. Shadows stretched across the floors, catching the yellow of Zora's suit and splitting it into light and lines. And in the space where power had once stood, truth had taken its seat. It started with one upload. A court staffer, silent during the morning's unraveling, sent a single 30-second clip from a courthouse security monitor to her cousin, who worked nights at a local news outlet. She didn't say much in the message, only, "Watch this before it disappears." The video opened with no music, no caption, no edits, just raw footage. A white officer jabbing his finger into a black woman's forehead. Then her silence. Then the badge. By 3:26 in the afternoon, the video had 12,000 views. By 5 o'clock, it passed 180,000. By 7, it hit 1 million. There was something about the image. Something about that blazing yellow suit set against a building designed in cold marble and colder policy. Something about the way Zora Mitchell stood without raising her voice, how she didn't flinch when confronted, how she didn't resist when pulled, and how, at just the right moment, she reached into her bag, placed a federal badge on the desk, and calmly looked her accuser in the eye. Now point to that. That clip looped and looped and looped. It showed Officer Brian Talcott, face tight with righteous assumption, stepping forward and pressing his finger into her forehead, not once, but twice. It showed her steady, unwavered, letting his actions write their own judgment. and it showed how, just moments later, she sat him down with a badge. Not a scream. No protests in that moment. No media circus. Just truth. Just evidence. Just posture. And that line, so measured it felt etched into stone, echoed across every caption and comment. Careful where you point. Sometimes the law points back. It became a hashtag, a headline, a movement. On TikTok, users stitched their own commentary over the footage. Young black women in suits of every color, repeating Zora's words like a warning. On Twitter, civil rights lawyers retweeted the clip with a two-word caption, "Watch everything." Instagram turned stills from the moment into digital art. Zora's chin slightly lifted, Brian's finger mid-air, the badge gleaming on the desk. By midnight, the video had passed 3.2 million views. By morning, 8.4 million. Cable news networks scrambled. Some tried to spin it, tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, a procedural misstep. But the footage didn't leave space for excuses. There was no audio manipulation, no ambiguity, just a series of events that anyone with a conscience could not unsee. More importantly, it was familiar. Every black parent who had told their child to stay calm even when it hurts saw that clip and recognized the silence. Every person who'd ever been told they were being too emotional or too assertive watched Zora stand still and realized this was what controlled power actually looked like. And the yellow suit? Oh, the yellow suit! It became the symbol. Tailors posted photos of recreations. Designers wrote essays about how color had become resistance. Editorial columns debated whether her choice was intentional. It didn't matter. Yellow had already become the color of visibility. On Capitol Hill, the footage was shown during a judiciary hearing on police conduct. A senator from Georgia played the clip in full, then turned to the room and said, "If she needed a badge to be believed, imagine how many people don't stand a chance." Some sat in shame, others in silence. No one challenged the footage. In schools, teachers played the video in law and ethics classes. "Let's talk about power and presence," one professor said. "Let's talk about how justice doesn't always come with volume." By the second day, networks tracked down Zora's name, but her file, like her posture, remained protected. No public statements, no press conference, no comment from the Department of Justice. Just the video, and the silence that followed. A silence that now spoke for millions. Civil rights groups released open letters calling for a full investigation into courthouse security personnel vetting. Hashtags trended beside Zora's quote. And for once, no one called her angry. No one called her aggressive. Because she had said almost nothing, and still broken the whole damn narrative. Brian Talcott's face became a meme. Not in cruelty, but in caution. People captioned his frozen expression with phrases like, "When you realize the courtroom's been watching you, not her. When your finger writes your own termination." And then came the deep dives. Journalists unearthed the 5 prior complaints buried in Brian's record. The same ones presented to the judge. People demanded answers. Why was this man still employed? Who sealed those complaints? How many more Brians are there? The department issued a short statement on the 3rd day. All internal review files relating to courthouse security are under active investigation. Officer Brian Talcott has been placed on indefinite leave pending further disciplinary review. But the court of public opinion had already moved on from punishment. It wasn't just about Brian anymore. It was about everyone who looked like Zora and wasn't believed. It was about every pointed finger that tried to write someone out of their own identity. And in city after city, photos surfaced. People standing outside courthouses in yellow suits, holding handmade signs with her words. One read, "The uniform doesn't make you right. Truth does." Another, "We're not new here. You just stopped looking away." Zora never responded publicly. She didn't need to, because sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that waits, the one that knows what's coming, the one that doesn't need to interrupt, because it already owns the final word. And Zora had delivered that word not from a podium, not from a protest, but from a chair in a courtroom, with a badge and a sentence. Now point to that. By the morning of the fourth day, the Department of Justice building in Washington, D.C. was ringed with media trucks, their cables snaking across sidewalks like vines drawn to power. Inside, behind doors stamped with national seals and layers of federal silence, an emergency DOJ session convened in a closed room with soundproof walls and no windows. The video of Zora Mitchell and Officer Brian Talcott played again, but no one flinched this time. Not out of numbness, but because every second had already been carved into memory. 12 senior officials, 4 internal affairs leads, and 2 cabinet-level observers sat around a polished table, each holding the same report: Zora's credentials, Brian's history, and the national reaction that followed. The words "public breach of protocol" appeared 17 times. But what hit harder was the part no one had written. Fear had changed sides. For the first time in decades, federal officers feared the lens of a hallway camera more than the voice of a protester. Not because someone was screaming, but because someone hadn't. Not because there was violence, but because there had been none. And still, the system had convicted itself. An oversight administrator leaned forward, knuckles tight around her pen. "This isn't about escalation anymore," she said. "It's about exposure." By the end of the session, an unprecedented measure passed: the formation of a civilian-embedded audit body across all federal court security operations. Every badge would be traceable, every complaint revisited, every officer subject to external and transparent review. And above all, no silence would protect misconduct ever again. The name on the founding memo was Zora Mitchell, but Zora didn't sign it. She didn't request it. She didn't even step into the room, because she didn't need to. Across the country, the ripple was immediate. Courthouses from Los Angeles to Chicago, Atlanta to Minneapolis began receiving letters from federal review officers marked "Observational Clearance Activated." Internal emails leaked, warning courthouse employees to adhere to standard conduct at all times, assume all interactions are monitored, and subject to federal scrutiny. In some buildings, officers changed their body language overnight. Some stood straighter. Some greeted visitors differently. Some simply turned their cameras back on. The shift wasn't loud. It was slow, internal, the kind of change that lives in posture, in reworded memos, in glances that carry accountability where arrogance once lived. And then the voices came, not from the outside, from within. Clerks who had seen fingers pointed at the wrong people. Junior officers who remembered whispers in locker rooms. Judges who had dismissed concerns because there wasn't enough to act on. Now they began to speak. Not in confession, in reckoning. One assistant prosecutor in Cleveland sent an anonymous affidavit to Internal Affairs. "I saw a black defendant searched 3 times by the same guard. I stayed silent. I told myself it wasn't my role. But I knew better." Zora reminded me what that silence costs. A court clerk in Boston sent in video stills from her archive, documenting 5 similar incidents, all dismissed without report. She attached the line: "What happened to her had already happened here. The difference is, this time, we all saw it." Even a retired judge issued a letter to the National Bar Association. "The courtroom used to be mine, but I realize now I was only presiding over what we refused to admit." The effect was not only legal, it was cultural. Zora's image, still seated, calm, yellow suit glowing under courtroom skylight, became a fixture in conversations about what law is supposed to look like, when it's not busy defending itself. Law schools assign the footage as required viewing. HR departments restructured bias training modules around the incident. Even the language began to change. Instead of disorderly, terms like overstepped, invasive, and unverified authority entered official vocabulary. And through all of this, Zora never gave a single interview. She declined every press request, ignored every podcast invite, and left every email unanswered. Not out of arrogance, not from exhaustion, but because her silence had already said everything the system wasn't ready to hear aloud. What could she possibly add? She had shown them the truth. She had let them film it. She had worn it, stitched in yellow thread, into a room where power was never meant to look like her. Now she let that image speak for itself, because now it wasn't her name on every headline. It was a question. If she needed a badge to be believed, how many people didn't have one? Every time it was asked, the silence that followed sounded like accountability. Every time her quote was shared, "Careful where you point. Sometimes the law points back." Someone who had once felt untouchable flinched, and somewhere behind the scenes, Zora kept doing her job. Quietly, efficiently, without applause, because she wasn't trying to be remembered. She was trying to be understood. And finally, the system, broken, bruised, slow as it was, had begun to listen. Not to her voice, but to her proof. And in a country that had grown used to watching pain before believing it, that shift meant everything. It was 10 minutes past 9 when the courtroom doors opened for the final time. No media swarm inside, no protests flanking the building, just the end of something that should never have begun. The people gathered weren't the loud ones. They were the kind who once stayed seated when injustice walked by. But today, they stood at the edge of a verdict. And in the stillness of that space, Zora Mitchell entered once more, wearing the same yellow suit that had become a symbol far beyond its stitching. 3 weeks had passed since the video went viral. 17 days since the Department of Justice declared sweeping oversight reforms. 42 hours since Officer Brian Talcott had finally been charged, not only for procedural misconduct, but for abuse of authority with racial motivation. Now, it was time for the courtroom, the very one he had once guarded with presumed entitlement, to speak back. Brian sat at the defendant's table, not in uniform, not in control. Just a man in a worn gray suit with eyes that refused to rise above the edge of the desk. His lawyer whispered beside him, but the words had stopped mattering. What could be said? Every frame had already been watched, every second catalogued, captioned, dissected, and understood. Zora didn't look at him when she walked in. She didn't need to. She walked straight to the witness stand, heels landing softly, each step echoing not in volume but in meaning. She raised her hand, took the oath, and sat down. And for a moment, just one, the yellow fabric shimmered beneath the courtroom skylight like it had the first day. But this time, the room knew what it meant. "Agent Mitchell," the prosecutor said, standing just far enough to give her space. "Do you have any final words for the court before sentencing?" Zora nodded once. Her voice was steady, measured as always, but this time it carried the full weight of something personal made permanent. She looked straight ahead, not at Brian, not at the gallery, at the seal above the judge's bench, and spoke. "He didn't just touch my forehead. He tried to rewrite my identity with his finger, tried to mark me as an intruder in a place I was sworn to protect. But I don't carry assumption. I carry authority, and I carry the truth in full print, not chalk." The courtroom didn't breathe. No reaction, no gasp, no applause. Just silence, the respectful kind. The kind that holds itself upright. Judge Renata Lyles, seated high behind the polished desk, leaned forward and spoke each word of the sentence with clarity. "Brian Talcott, You are hereby convicted of abuse of authority with racial motivation and obstruction of federal assignment. You are sentenced to 6 years in federal prison without eligibility for badge, clearance, or public service reinstatement. Effective immediately, you are banned from holding any position in law enforcement or civil security at any level, local or federal. The gavel fell once, not loudly, just enough. Brian's lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder. Brian didn't move. He stared at the grain in the wood of the table as if looking for an escape inside it. Zora stood. She turned, not to leave, but to walk up to the bench. From her bag, she removed the black leather case, the badge that had started it all. She didn't flash it. She didn't hold it high. She simply placed it gently on the bench's edge and stepped back. The judge didn't touch it. No one did. Because by now, it wasn't proof anymore. It was a reminder. A symbol of what had been challenged, doubted, violated, and still refused to fold. You can't unsee the color that exposes what power tried to erase. Those words were not spoken aloud, but they lived in the room, in every stare, in every upright spine, in every corner that had once echoed with complicity and now stood cleared by the stillness of her presence. The courtroom didn't rise in applause. It rose in respect. People stood, not for spectacle, not for drama, but because something sacred had walked in, made its case without begging, and left truth where denial once sat. Zora nodded once to the judge, then to no one, and she walked out. Her heels clicked just twice before the sound vanished under carpet. She didn't stop at the door, didn't turn back, because this was never about returning. It was about reminding that power unearned is fragile. That silence is a weapon when wielded with clarity. That one badge, laid down without tremble, can shift more than policy. It can pierce memory. Outside, the sun was waiting. It caught her shoulder as she stepped through the glass doors and bathed the yellow fabric in something between gold and fire. Somewhere behind her, Officer Talcott was led away, still silent, and the badge sat where she'd left it, untouched, unneeded, but never invisible. What happened in that courtroom was not just about a badge, a yellow suit, or a viral video. It was about who gets believed and why. Zora Mitchell didn't shout. She didn't protest. She didn't even raise her hand. She simply walked, stood, endured, and exposed a truth millions recognized immediately. That in America, silence doesn't mean absence, and presence doesn't require permission. Her calm dismantled decades of assumed authority. Her stillness indicted an entire culture of unchecked power. And her words, "Careful where you point. Sometimes the law points back," now live beyond a courtroom. They live in every hallway, every office, every moment when someone decides to trust a uniform before a truth. That's the lesson for every American citizen watching. Justice doesn't begin when someone is arrested. It begins when someone is seen. Zora carried her badge in leather, but her authority lived in how she moved through a system that wasn't designed to protect her. We all have a role. Whether you work in policy, education, security, or simply walk by a courthouse every day, you have a voice, a vote, and a choice. If this story made you pause, made you reflect, made you feel like maybe the system cracked just enough to let the light in, then share it. Because the fight for justice doesn't end with a sentence. It begins with awareness and grows through action. One view isn't enough. One voice isn't enough. But one truth, multiplied, becomes change. So here's your part. Subscribe to this channel for more real stories that demand to be heard. Like this video if Zora's silence spoke to you louder than any headline. And share it if you believe in a country where justice should not depend on the color of your skin or the silence of your resistance. Over 10 million people have watched this story. Let's make it 10 million more. Not for fame, not for clicks, but because we cannot fix what we refuse to face. And today, like Zora Mitchell once showed us, we face it, not with noise, but with clarity that cannot be erased. Watch again, reflect deeper, then speak louder. Not just online, but everywhere power walks unchallenged.